Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of the early years of the Great Depression and how hard things had gotten for many Americans, particularly by the worst year, 1932. And so in this lecture, we're going to continue talking about how Americans coped and managed to survive as the Depression hit its worst depths. The Depression reached those at the lower echelons of society the quickest. Mexican immigrants in California and the West were relieved of their jobs in agriculture to make room for displaced whites. Over the next several years, tens of thousands of Mexicans would make their way back to Mexico, either voluntarily or by force, as many of them were deported as the economy reached its worst depths. These were also particularly hard times for blacks. They tended to be working in those industries most quickly displaced: construction, manufacturing, or manual labor. They as well were often replaced by white workers. As Langston Hughes, the black poet, wrote, "The Depression brought everybody down a peg or two, and the Negroes had but few pegs to fall." These were particularly hard times for blacks in the South, who made their living through agriculture. Cotton prices plummeted. Droughts damaged crops further, starting in 1930. Racial tensions increased, and the number of lynchings increased. Poor whites in the South reacted to the Depression often with violence against blacks, and so lynchings and miscarriages of justice grew more common during the Great Depression. The most notorious and infamous case arose in 1933, the Scottsboro case, in which 9 poor blacks were convicted of raping 2 white women on a train. Under very suspicious circumstances, there was a hasty trial held, and 5 of them in the aftermath served lengthy prison terms, even as one of the women came out and confessed that the crime had never occurred. We'll talk more about this case and other examples in a future lecture that focuses on minorities during the Great Depression. Times were especially hard in the farm belt across the middle part of the country. The Dust Bowl, the phenomenon which lasted from about 1934 to 41, when there were huge dust storms sweeping across the middle part of the country and growing any crops at all, became almost impossible. We're going to talk much more about the Dust Bowl and the impact of these events when we discuss The Worst Hard Time, the book that we're reading about this. And so leading out of this was a massive exodus out of the farm belt, not just because of the dust storms, but also falling farm prices, isolation, health concerns, mechanization, corporatization of farms, and other issues. Some 400,000 Americans migrated out of the Great Plains during the Depression, many of them never to return. The Great Depression also exacted a heavy psychological and emotional toll. We talk about the Great Depression in economic terms, but it also fits with the emotional definition of depression. People lived under constant fear of losing their jobs and the constant struggle of caring for their families. Women were suffering, families were suffering, marriage and birth rates dropped. Many felt ashamed of their conditions. As one person described it, "We didn't go hungry, but we lived lean." Well, certainly many Americans did go hungry, but lots of others did live lean. They lived between the extremes of wealth and poverty and starvation. They weren't necessarily heavily invested in stocks, but they weren't well-to-do either. Most weren't on the breadlines, but times were very lean. They had to make do. As one writer remembered, "I've lived in cities for many months, broke, without help, too timid to get in the breadlines. I've known many women to live like this until they simply faint on the street from privations, without saying a word to anyone. A woman will shut herself up in a room until it is taken away from her, and eat a cracker a day, and be as quiet as a mouse." People of this generation were ashamed, often too proud to ask for help. And in many cases they lived very stressful, depressed lives. One man wondered, What is to become of us? I've lost 12.5 pounds this last month just thinking. You can't sleep, you know. You wake up at 2 a.m. and you think and you lie. So, how did people survive? Well, in some ways, it was just a case of trying to maintain a sense of normality to life. Try to keep up appearances and stay busy, even if they weren't working and earning a living. People painted their homes, in some cases constantly. It was said that our fences were never whiter and our homes were never cleaner than during the Great Depression because people were painting their fences constantly and sweeping and cleaning all the time. There also was a great deal of neighborhood cooperation. Neighborhoods, formally and informally, created neighborhood associations to help each other. When one person had a job and was doing okay, they would help out others because they knew at any given time, on any given day, the roles might be reversed. There are stories of truck drivers who knew that people in a certain area were struggling, taking a corner a little bit too hard and dumping part of a load of oranges or a load of coal on the road in a certain neighborhood. Hobos developed elaborate networks of chalk markings telling them which homes might share some food or spare change. Families slowly devoured their savings. Many then went on relief where they were forced to live on just a few dollars a week. That generation developed a sense of miserliness and appreciation for money unlike future generations. And any of you who might have grandparents or perhaps great-grandparents who lived through the Great Depression might know that they lived the rest of their lives pinching pennies, not spending money on anything, preserving everything because they had grown up and grown accustomed to that level of poverty. One woman commented, "The great majority reacted by thinking money is the most important thing in the world. Get yours and get it for your children. Nothing else matters. Not having that stark terror of losing your savings come at you again." What impact did the Depression have on families and on society during this time? Well, working patterns changed. Families took to doing in the home everything they could. Americans in general didn't eat out as much back then, but they ate out far less during the Depression. They often made their own clothes and made whatever they could at home. As many people in the family as could find jobs tended to work. Mothers worked, children worked. Everybody pitched in and contributed. And as I've noted, the birth rate nationally declined during the Great Depression as couples and families contemplated the cost of having to raise another child. Up to this point in our history, children were often seen as a resource, particularly as we look at a picture like this. You think of families on the farm. Well, children are actually a source of labor. But during the Depression, children became another mouth to feed, became a burden. And so many families began making the choice not to have as many children. Americans also sought aid from various sources during the Great Depression. And we're going to talk in the next lecture about Herbert Hoover as president and his views on federal sources of aid during this time. But in short, he resisted fiercely the idea that the federal government should take responsibility for directly assisting the needy during this time. So there wasn't a lot of federal aid available in this early part of the Great Depression. Many Americans sought aid from state and local institutions, from their employers and their churches. And these institutions generally tried to help as much as they could and as long as they could. Many businesses resisted layoffs and wage cuts for as long as possible. But as the Depression deepened, these resources disappeared. Businesses began to slash whatever little welfare plans they had. Wages were cut, layoffs increased. So money from employers became more and more scarce. As I've described several times, banks often were closing down, so even if they tried to provide loans early in the Depression, many of them closed. Similarly, churches, which is always on the front line of assistance for Americans in need, began to run out of money, as the first thing to go for many Americans is putting money in the offering plate. So Americans were forced to seek aid wherever they could. They found themselves in bread lines or seeking out soup kitchens. They wore hand-me-down clothes. They ate beans instead of meat and then bread instead of beans. Aid was few and far between in this period. It might be a local business one day. It might be a local church or even an individual person setting up bread lines. But by the worst of the Depression, many Americans found themselves living in the streets with no source of aid available to them. What about the man in the White House? Well, we'll talk in the next lecture about Herbert Hoover and how he attacked, or failed to attack, the Great Depression.